This is Gate 4 of the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, California. Although Warner Brothers and its production lot are some of the most iconic images of Hollywood, a lot of people aren't aware of some of the darker parts of its history and the blood spilled at these very gates just over 75 years ago. This story doesn't have a happy ending, but it does have what for many is likely the expected ending. This is the 1945 CSU set decorators strike and its aftermath, the longest and bloodiest strike in Hollywood history. It involves corruption, violence, and the Chicago mob, and takes a rather long time to tell, so let's begin. It's the early 1930s, and the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees is Cruft. The IATSE is a labor union representing thousands of creatives such as artists, carpenters, and technicians in live theater, motion pictures, and trade shows in North America. However, in 1932, two men named William Bioff and George E. Brown, the business manager of a Chicago stagehand local of the IATSE, began to extort theater and nightclub owners in the Chicago area. Essentially, the venues would give the two of them money if they kept the stagehands from striking. It was an effective racket, but as rackets go, it caught the eye of Frank Nito, Chicago mobster and successor of Al Capone, who made the two of them an offer. If they give the mob 2/3 of their profits, he doesn't kill them. It's not an offer one typically turns down. Eventually, Nito wanted to expand the mob's influence to the entertainment industry and sought to go national. He accomplished that with a fun little tool called corrupt politics. In 1934, George E. Brown would run unopposed for IATSE president. This was valuable as all strikes by the IATSE had to be sanctioned by the president, meaning that George E. Brown, and by extension Nito and the Chicago mob, now had control over all IATSE union activities. With this newfound control, they relocated to Hollywood, where they continued their extortion racket on a much more profitable scale, going after the major Hollywood production studios, extorting money in return for keeping the union passive and the wages low. For them, things were looking up, but as many things do, the cracks eventually began to appear. In 1941, Brown and Bioff would catch the full brunt of the federal government. On May 24th of that year, the two frontmen for the operation would be indicted with federal racketeering charges in the state of New York. In terms of federal charges, racketeering is one of the ones you want the least. As can be expected, the two were found guilty on October 30th after a month-long trial. Facing up to 30 years each, Bioff got 10 years, with Brown getting 8. Additionally, both were fined $20,000, or just shy of $400,000 in 2022. So, slight little intermission. While I was trying to find a picture of William Bioff, I found that he and Brown actually testified against several members of the Chicago mob, hence their lesser sentences. Also pretty important to the story that I just missed, I guess, was that Frank Nito, the mobster who originally approached Brown and Bioff, actually committed suicide the day before he was set to appear in court for charges related to the extortion. People will actually recognize him, probably, or at least his dead body, from The Godfather, where a picture of his dead body is used during the War of the Five Families montage. And then the craziest part, on top of all of that, is that soon after several of the members of the mob that Brown and Bioff testified against were released in 1955, years after all the events of this story, William Bioff gets fucking assassinated via a dynamite bomb rigged to his car's starter. It's absolutely batshit. I don't know how I missed that. Immediately, the mob replaced the two of them, with Richard Walsh taking over as president and Roy Brewer taking over Hollywood operations. With these replacements, nothing fundamentally changed. The major studios payrolled them, and they continued to ensure their workers were underpaid and unable to strike. For context, at this time, Hollywood had two unions that were responsible for backlog crafts. Firstly, you had the IATSE Local 37, a superlocal responsible for the vast majority of backlog crafts. That was actually broken up into 4 separate locals after a failed rebellion against the mob control of the union. The second was the Confederation of Studio Unions, or CSU, run by prominent early Hollywood union leader Herb Sorrell, who was promoted to president after heading the successful 1941 Walt Disney Animators strike, which led to Disney recognizing the Screen Cartoonists Guild. As an extension of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners International Union, the CSU represented the carpenters and other crafts such as the painters and cartoonists. Unlike the IATSE, the CSU was an actual functioning union that was run as an actual democratic organization, with each local having its own autonomy and power to call a strike. The seeds for conflict between the two unions were planted when 77 set decorators would break away from the IATSE and form the Society of Motion Pictures Interior Decorators, or SMPID. They would negotiate their own contract with the major producers, and for several years they operated as their own association. However, in 1943, they would associate with the CSU in direct defiance of the IATSE. As a result, when Herb Sorrell attempted to negotiate a contract that included the SMPID, the producers stalled the process. They allowed the IATSE to intervene in the negotiations, who claimed that they had the authority over the set decorators. After another 5-month stall, an arbitrator was appointed by the War Labor Board, which was a mediation board that was established by executive order during World War II in order to settle labor disputes. Although the arbitrator ruled in favor of the CSU and the set decorators voted for CSU 1421 to represent them, the producers chose to ignore the arbitrator's decision, setting the stage for the strike. On March 12th, more than 10,000 CSU workers would go on strike. Initially, pickets began at the major studios, including Disney, Columbia, Universal, Fox, and Warner Brothers, but would eventually spread out to the movie theaters in Los Angeles, setting a stage with the CSU fighting a war against not just the producers, but also the IATSE. At this time, the studios had a combined 130 films ready for release, a supply that would last for the next 9 months, with the thought process that the strike couldn't go on for that long because at this point there had only been one major strike, which was the Disney animators strike, which didn't go on for nearly as long. Despite this surplus of films, Disney and Monogram, as well as some other independent studios, would almost immediately bargain with Local 1421. Columbia, Universal, Fox, MGM, and Paramount did not. As the strike continued, the producers began to feel the heat. RKO was forced to suspend production on Duel in the Sun when Gregory Peck, Jennifer Jones, Joseph Cotton, Lillian Gish, and Walter Houston unilaterally refused to work as a result of the picketing. Cary Grant and Alexa Smith failed to appear to do retakes for Night and Day. Fellow star Eleanor Parker doesn't appear for a screen test, which is also cancelled. Aldous Huxley actually joins the picketers on the CSU picket lines. MGM also had to vacate the shooting at Hollywood Park Racetrack after several of the track's employees threatened to walk out if the shooting was allowed to continue. All in all, many movie stars at the time were disturbed by the anti-union sentiments of the producers, and despite the producers wanting to maintain the perception that the strike was nothing beyond a mild annoyance, the veil was beginning to slip. Despite strict orders from the definitely not corrupt IATSE President Richard Walsh, several thousand IA workers won't cross the picket line, even under threats of fines and membership terminations. Some 1,500 members even rebel and hold a meeting separate from the rest of the IATSE. The meeting's organizers would later be stripped of their IA membership. Despite these rebellious groups, the IATSE would push forward in their collusion with the producers, attempting to form another local that would replace the CSU entirely. As you might expect, from here the strike became ugly and violent. It's now October of 1945, and the CSU is very quickly finding itself without much money. In a cruel coincidence, this specific October also contained record-high temperatures for the area at the time, which exacerbated the strikers' anxiety and impatience. They still cannot get most of the major studios to negotiate with them, and as a result, they are out of work, and their savings, if they have any, are running out quickly. They need to stand their ground. It's October 5th, and in the early hours of the morning, Herb Sorrell gathers upwards of 300 strikers outside of the gates of Warner Bros. Between them and the gates stood strikebreakers, police, and Chicago mobsters. Just after 4 a.m., the strikebreakers attacked. They smashed through the picket line with cars at full speed, hospitalizing 4 strikers, before advancing towards the line, armed with a multitude of weapons, ranging from chains to tear gas to rifles. According to Sorrell, the fire hoses were dragged out, they turned them on the people's feet and just swept them right out from under. They threw tear gas bombs, and it was a slaughter. It's pretty shocking that nobody died. All in all, several dozen strikers were hospitalized, and the event was heavily publicized across the country, with millions of eyes now turned towards Hollywood. Within a month, the strike was essentially over. At this moment, nobody had won, and the lengthy process of arbitration had begun. Technically, the CSU won, as they got jurisdiction over the set decorators, but the IATSE was not ready to back down, especially since during the strike they had hired replacements for all of the striking CSU workers, meaning that they had the manpower to encroach on the CSU's territory whenever possible. You see, this oversight by the jurisdictional panel was due to the ruling that these strikers must return to their jobs, ousting the replacement workers, and the replacement workers were to receive severance pay. However, as you might notice with that ruling, the IATSE was not ordered to actually get rid of those replacements, meaning that the IATSE had essentially an entire union equivalent of replacement workers that were ready to take CSU's place if the time ever came. And the IATSE was hell-bent on making the CSU pay. As a test, all IATSE workers who supported the CSU were prevented from returning to work, locking them out of their jobs as a form of punishment. For anyone at the time, it was clear that this was far from over. In the next part, we'll cover violence bombings in the display of top-grade judicial and bureaucratic corruption.